Thank you for joining us. Please enjoy the event.
Hello, I'm Thanasi Kambanis, Director of Century International. Thanks for joining us today for our event on power politics and Shia Islamism in Iraq. I know lots of people's attention is focused elsewhere today with the ongoing war in Israel and Gaza, but we thank those who have joined us today, and you can always watch this event later on Century Foundation's YouTube channel. So today I've got an incredible group of colleagues together, and we're talking about a subject that we've been working on for about 3 years of research. We just have published this book called Shia Power Comes of Age, The Transformation of Islamist Politics in Iraq from 2003 to 2023. A lot of the ideas and findings that you'll be hearing about today are available in this book and in related reports and commentaries that are published on the Century Foundation's website, tcf.org, so you can look there for reference. I'm going to introduce each guest as I bring them into the conversation, rather than rattling off everyone's bio at the beginning. And just a note for our viewers, we'll be identifying ourselves by name and maybe a short description for low vision or blind viewers as we come online. So I'm Thanasi Kambanis. You see me with a bookshelf in the background. I've got short hair. And today we're going to be talking about a question that has shaped and I would argue distorted a lot of politics and policy making in Iraq and really in the broader Middle East and Islamic world, certainly in the last 20 years. And it's the question of what does Islamism mean? And specifically in Iraq's context, what does Shia Islamism mean? In the era after the US invasion and the fall of Saddam, sect and religion was foisted with an unbelievable amount of I would say unearned significance. A lot of policymakers, the US Occupation Authority, and a lot of Iraqi politicians and clerics themselves resorted to an almost simple and essentialist formula that Islamism or Shia Islamism was a coherent, the claim was it was a coherent political identity, and it would explain how people would behave in power, how people would govern, and how Iraq would develop. Events over the last 20 years have forced a reconsideration of how we understand Islamism and how we understand specifically Shia Islamism in Iraq's context. And in a state where over 20 years, over a 20-year period, the dominant political factions have almost all been self-described as Shia Islamist, we've been forced to try and seek a new understanding of what then are the differences among them, and what does that idea Shia Islamism mean, and what are the other ideas that are shaping and driving politics. So I'm going to turn first to the director of this research project, Sajad Jiyad, who is a fellow at Century International and also the director of the Iraq Bridge in Baghdad. Sajad, explain a little bit what was the point of this inquiry, and what is it that we and you are hoping to learn by exploring this question about Shia Islamism?
Thank you, Thanasi. Good morning to everybody. My name is Sajad Jiyad. I'm wearing a pink shirt, sitting in front of a virtual bookcase. I'm based in Baghdad. So, when we discuss the sort of beginnings of this project, it's been more than 2 years now. I think one of the reasons that really pushed us to get to work was the fact that there was so little on the subject. You hardly pick up any books on Shia Islamism anywhere, whether it's in Iraq or the rest of the Middle East. And certainly not enough has gone into the details of Iraqi politics, sort of in the post-American period. So after the Americans withdrew in 2011 from Iraq, there was really not much attention anymore. There was a 2-3 year period where, because of the rise of ISIS from 2014 to 2017, and the battle to liberate sort of northern Iraq from the grip of ISIS, there was more attention on Iraq. But apart from that period, I would say in the last sort of 12 years at least, there certainly has not been enough material that has looked into the details of how Iraq's political system operates, what are the ideologies that drive some of these parties, and particularly with regards to Shia politics, some of the nuances, some of the agendas, for example, and drilling down on exactly how the power sharing sort of model works and what tools they use to enforce it. And so I think that need to research, the need to publish, I think was very important for us. Second was to sort of address some of the details of how the political system operates, the Muhassasa, for example, this sort of sectarian, ethno-sectarian power sharing, how that operates, I think comes up quite a bit in discussions these days. The specific parties, what are their agendas, and how Islamists are the Islamists, or is it just power politics and pragmatic, power plays? And I think we try to cover that in the book through the various chapters. I mean, we look at personalities, we look at sort of the role of religion, we look at the use of violence comes up, we look at electoral strategies, we look at sort of the history of some of these movements. So when you put all that together, I think we've got a rich volume that touches upon sort of multiple disciplines, I would say. And also it ends with several questions about what the future is. What happens when these parties, these Islamist parties, become less popular? What happens when the threat of violence is no longer enough to govern the country? So in that regard, I think we've put out sort of several explainers on what has happened and why, and then also some questions about what could happen and where things could go from here. And I think that's particularly relevant in today as well.
And we can't overstate how central claims about identity, religion, and sect have been to the development of political dynamics in Iraq since 2003. It's been almost ubiquitous that players both inside and outside the system try to explain or define themselves or their opponents or their political movements by these essentialist identity labels. And we'll come back to this question when I come back to you, Sajad. But for my next question, I want to turn to Taif Alkhudary, who's a doctoral candidate, DPhil candidate at Cambridge, and a longtime Iraq researcher. Taif, we've seen a system mature in Iraq in which most of the dominant factions, the people who hold power and have money and resources and militias at their disposal, define themselves by religion, sect, and identity, right? They use these labels, Shia Islamist, and under the guise of governing with these labels, they've really failed serially to deliver whether it's well-being or rights or community to Iraq's citizens. That led in large part to the October protest, the Tishreen movement of 2019, which has been the most significant and lasting challenge to the sectarian allotment, the sectarian power sharing system of Iraq. And I'd love it if you could walk us through what are the alternative political ideas or themes that have grown out of the Tishreen movement, and how do those challenge and if they do present an alternative to a essentialist system that's based on being a Shia Islamist as the way of defining politics?
Sure. So it's Taif speaking. I'm wearing a black shirt. I have black hair, which is tied up, and I'm sitting in front of a white wall. So I think what I tried to write about in my paper was the way that in 2019, what we saw was a consolidation of this idea that the populace no longer wanted to be represented by a political system based on their ethnicity and sect, and rather they wanted to be represented on the basis of their Iraqi identity. And what really consolidated or spurred this idea, I think, in 2019 in particular, even though it had began to develop maybe in 2011, was the fact that there was so much violence against protesters. And so this idea, which under Iraq's constitutional system, that if you vote for someone from your sect, they're supposed to represent you and protect you. And what became clear to all the protesters was that this was no longer the case. And so we saw this consolidation. And I think beyond that, what drove this idea was this recognition that the kind of democracy that people had been promised in Iraq was only procedural in form, insofar as people were allowed to go out and vote. But since 2003, they'd really just seen a rotation of the same faces and parties. And therefore, a lot of the protesters felt that they didn't have any real say in decision making. So what we saw overall was a move, as is often sort of stated by protesters, or a desire for a state of citizens that represents citizens, as opposed to a state of parties, which represents the political parties that have captured the state since 2003.
And when, to put too fine a point on it, when we say a state of parties, we're really talking about a state of parties that are sectarian, or certainly sectarian identified, right? There are Shia Islamist parties, there are Sunni Islamist parties, there are Kurdish parties, and then very smaller ones. And so if you are an Iraqi shopping for representation, all your choices are not programmatic, not ideological, actually, they are identity based. And I'm curious, I mean, do people see within those choices, do they see it? Like if you're a Shia voter, do you feel like you have a full array of ideological choices within the Shia basket? Or, I mean, how do those choices as in a political marketplace read to a voter or a citizen looking for someone to give them maybe something more than just the chance at a job in their sectarian patronage network?
It's Taif speaking again. I'm wearing a black top and I'm sitting in front of a white background. I mean, as far as I can tell, there aren't really any programs, there aren't really ideologies. I think that people, for the most part, are driven to vote on the basis of clientelism. And I think this kind of clientelism shows us why people like Noor al-Maliki is still, knocking about, given that he's been accused of, he was highly implicated in the rise of ISIS and sort of sectarianization. So I think there is no ideological basis, but maybe other people can speak better on this issue than I can.
Great, and we'll come back to as we sort of tease out what does it mean to define as a Shia Islamist. We'll also hopefully be able to tease out what sort of burgeoning alternatives there are in the political space. Now I want to turn to Renad Mansour. He's the director of the Iraq program at Chatham House, and also a long-term researcher of Iraqi politics on the ground, with a really great granular sense of not only how people talk and define themselves, but also how political movements behave and act in their pursuit of power. Renad, you wrote for this project about the use of violence as a tool or mechanism of political negotiation. And I want to ask you first to sort of explain how this prism of violence as negotiation is a helpful way of trying to answer the question of what does Shia Islamist politics mean today?
Sure. Hello, this is Renad. I'm wearing a white shirt with a bookcase and a plant behind me. So the essay that I wrote, the chapter that I wrote in this book, centered around the role of violence, both in Shia politics, but also in sort of the post-2003 Iraqi state. And it begins sort of with this story of events following the 2021 national elections, where groups from the sort of Fatah alliance that did not do as well as they had hoped were able to leverage their coercive capital in a way to keep their sort of spot on the table. And what we began to see, and what I became interested in throughout these years of studying the Iraqi state, is what are the rules to violence? Because there is a form of violence that is permissible, that is actually built into the political system. It's part of negotiating power. So it's not necessarily illegal. In the same way that when we talk about corruption as part of the system, we say it's not necessarily illegal. Forms of violence are de facto part of bargaining for the state, and therefore considered inclusive. And that became very clear after 2021 and those elections. And this all goes back to the moment in 2003 when the new Iraqi state is built. The groups that are able to have power, that are able to negotiate, all have their own links and sort of access to private arms. This becomes an important leverage for them to maintain power as well as maintain impunity. And this, these groups in this book, focusing on the Shia groups, are primarily two networks. One of the networks goes back to the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, which was formed in the 1980s in Iran as an opposition movement, a Shia opposition movement against the Saddam Hussein, the Ba'athist regime. It had an armed wing, the Badr Corps, which would later become the Badr Organization. But it would also include many of leaders such as Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and other sort of senior members who would become important Shia armed leaders in the post-2003 Iraqi state. The other side of Shia violence is the Sadrists, who were sort of this Iraq sort of grown organic movement that militarized in 2003 onwards, again, using Shiism, but to push back against the American occupation and sort of other opponents. So these are the two main bodies of violence, but these become the main Shia actors. And so the point of the chapter is to show that military authority is an important source of power for Iraq Shia elites, and they need it and they rely on it to maintain power, to maintain impunity in the political system, to negotiate. But it also tells us what the Iraqi state is, and I think this is important, right? So many people want to, hold on to this idea that the state is a state with a monopoly over legitimate violence, right? This sort of Weberian idea, this neo-Weberian idea. And in a way, what the chapter is saying is this violence is legitimate, right? Because it's permissible. So you still kind of have a coherence of legitimate violence. It's just not in the government institutions that someone thinking that the Iraqi state should be closer to something that came out of 19th century Europe should be. So it's very telling of what the state is, and the Shia groups become the strongest power in this new state, and the military access to military is important.
So, and some of what you're arguing here relates to a sort of environment where there's a weak state, and therefore these sort of parastatal or parallel channels of violence, persist and gain power. I want to probe a little bit into the what, if any, specifically Shia dimensions there are to the sort of political economy of Shia militias that we talk about. I mean, it's my impression that the both strands or sort of both groupings of Shia armed groups that you identify here benefit from and enjoy a sort of special space and sense of legitimacy in Iraqi society because of their connection or purported connection to the shrines and to religious figures. And I'm specifically remembering the moment in the fall of 2003 after violent attacks terrorist attacks in Najaf against worshippers, a lot of groups that had kept their militias in the background brought them out to the front with a lot of popular acclaim. They were there to protect the shrines and to protect worshippers from terrorism, from anti-Shia terrorism, and that was, I think, a sort of precursor of a sort of escalating series of these kinds of legitimation, sectarian legitimation of armed groups, and I'm wondering if you see a particular dynamic in I don't know if we want to call it a political economy of violence or a community of armed groups, but in any case, is there a sort of special mechanism or special set of dynamics around these Shia armed groups that has given them additional legitimacy or power, or has enshrined is probably not the right word to use here, has institutionalized their role as a parallel arbiter of political negotiation?
Sure. This is Renad wearing a white shirt with a bookcase behind me. So I think that's right. The religious legitimacy has been very important to these groups. Certainly in 2014, the creation of the popular mobilization forces, which would be in sort of the state institutionalization of these groups, came from the fatwa. They make the claim from the fatwa from Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani. And they are, they're constantly referring back to the fatwa and sort of the duty. But what I also found that's important to their legitimacy is they very much see themselves as the protectorate of the system. And so these were the groups that were on the front line defending Iraq from ISIS when the Iraqi military disintegrated. And in a different way, they see themselves as protecting the system from other threats, whether they're coming from civil society or other forms of sort of system threats. They are there to defend them. And when you speak to them, that's a really important point they make. We are the state. And it's very important that they present themselves as being part of the government, being in the state, making authority through the institutions, getting paid from the state. All of these sort of markers of statehood are as important to them as, of course, the religious element that they've been sort of relying on for legitimacy. So I would sort of point to those two as being very important markers for their pursuit of legitimacy.
Thank you, Renad. So now I'm going to turn to Luisa Fantappie, who's the director of the Middle East program at the Institute of International Affairs in Rome. The organization name is Italian, but I don't want to embarrass myself with my poor Italian pronunciation. So one of the questions that we tried to answer in this project is, if sectarian or religious identity is not a useful way of explaining how politics unfolds, what is a more useful way of understanding the way Iraqi politics have unfolded in reality, sort of underneath this simplifying label of Shia Islamism? And Maria, you did a really interesting historical study of three of Iraq's most consequential post-occupation prime ministers, and tell us what you found about what might be one of the more important alternative ways of explaining and understanding how power and politics really unfolds.
Thank you, Tanas. This is Maria speaking. I have brown hair and I'm wearing a white shirt and I'm sitting in an office. This piece for me was very important because I tried to deploy a new methodology on how to understand how power works in Iraq, looking at the trajectories of specific personalities within one party, which has played an important role throughout the history of post-invasion Iraq, which is the Dawa party. Three of the prime minister of of Iraq are actually have been member of this and are member of this party. And so the novelty of this methodology has been really that one of introducing biographical elements that relates to Ibrahim al-Jafari, who was prime minister and the first prime minister of Iraq, or the first elected government, then Maliki, who served 2 mandates, and then Haider al-Abadi. And the biographical elements to me, and the history on how they live, for example, the years of exiles, as well as the interaction and the informal connections that they tied with other Shia movements that are based, for example, in Iran, or other Iraqi opposition movements, which are based in London, for instance, or the relation that they tied to external powers, whether it's Iran, post-revolutionary Iran, or the West, when Western powers started in the 90s to support the Iraqi opposition. All this has informed in some way the way in which Shia politics has been sort of cooking up within this party. And so what we discover is that, the Shia, the Iraqi Dawa party is basically all the time facing this sort of existential question, which is how can we shift from an exile movement to a governing party? How can we govern a state? And how and if our vision and our program as a Shia Islamist party should actually differ or should be in line with the experience of post-revolutionary Iran. And I think that the 3 personalities that emerge from the chapter, they try all different sort of projects. So we have Jafari, who really tried to, is very much influenced, of course, by his experience of exile in Iran, and he tries to build up a system where Shia governance, it's within the Shia, so it's a community-based system. This is why also it was so impactful in shaping the Muhasasa ethno-sectarian system at the very early beginning in the post-invasion period, because the idea there was that the Shia should represent the Shia, the Kurds should represent the Kurds, and so on and so forward. Then you have a Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, who really tried at some point to sort of overcome the boundary of the Shia of the Shia communities, but fails and then retreats actually back into the Shia community and its constituencies and push back against the Sunnis. And then you have the experience of Haider al-Abadi, who really tries to build what we could say is a sort of civic state, which is very much focused on reform of the institutions, while Maliki was very much putting forward the governance, which was based on a neo-patrimonial system. So once again, the methodology I try to put forward, it's really one that is based on the personality of the individuals, but also it highlights the existential tensions within the Shia politics, which are really how do we define an Iraqi Shia politics versus the Iranian post-revolutionary experience? How do we define our own relation with other communities and other political representatives of other communities? And how do we define our relations with external players, the United States and Iranian? And I think that the conclusion is that the 3 prime ministers have been struggling to find answers to these questions, but they haven't really found the formula to actually really put forward the project of a Iraqi Shia Islamist governance.
Well, and what this case study you put together really shows baldly. So we have 3 men who are all from the Dawa party, right? They're all self-defined as Shia Islamists. They're all from the Dawa movement, and yet, it's as if they're almost from entirely different political streams when they govern. They follow very different policies from, things as simple as how close they're willing to be to the Americans versus the Iranians, to these questions of civic versus sectarian state. And so that gives very clear lie to the idea that like being a Shia Islamist is somehow an explanatory framework for understanding what someone is going to do in power. In fact, being a Shia Islamist in these three cases tells us nothing about what these leaders pursued as a governing agenda. Although being a self-defined Shia Islamist was obviously an important factor to these men and their followers in a variety of ways, it simply was a inadequate way of understanding what they would do politically.
Yes, I think you are right. I think that by 2003, I think that the Shia, the Dawa party was very very skilled at sort of being in this centrist position where they were like. On the one hand, managing, the relations with the non-Shia opposition. They had strong relations with the Kurds, in particular, the Kurdish parties. They were also very skilled at balancing, at some point, Iran and the West. But I think that the problem that they find out already in 2014, at the moment in which ISIS breaks out, which is the moment when actually it's the proof that their vision of how to build a state, it's actually not there. This project of Shia governance wasn't yet ready, I think, by the time that they took power, and so they keep going back and forward, stealing some of the governance playbook of Saddam Hussein in terms of like the neo-patrimonial network, stealing some of the way of governance of the post-revolutionary Iran, and therefore like it's a very hybrid form of governance that comes up. However, as a last point, I will say that my conclusion is that despite the established Shia parties that are protagonists of the post-2003 are actually, they didn't manage to put together this vision of Shia governance. I will say that this dialectic with what was the domestic Shia position of the father of Muqtada al-Sadr, so the Sadrist movement, it's still a very important variable to watch, because it's precisely from this dialectic between, for example, the Dawa and competition and rivalry between the Dawa party and the Sadrist movement, that some of this unresolved issue that define Iraq Shia politics there will be some responses from this dialectic. So again, Shia politics remains an important variable to define Shia governance at the level of the Middle East, and to define Iraq political system.
Sajad, clerics have always played a prominent public role in Iraqi public life, and certainly since 2003, clerical authority, fatwas, clerical leadership have been at least a central reference point for conversations about politics, power, reform, electoral campaigns. So help us put a finger on this question, because I think that there's maybe a misconception, or anyway, there's a widely held belief that behind the politicians, clerics and the Hawza are the most powerful institution in Iraq. Can you help us understand how we should think about the amount of power that the Shia clerics hold, and how, if at all, they can steer or affect political outcomes, whether it's elections or legislative battles?
So this is Sajad again. I mean, maybe it's a question of what if the Shia Islamist parties had been involved in the effort to remove Saddam? What if they had managed to, have a very clear governing agenda? So, as Maria explained, if they had a very clear plan and they managed to run Iraq very well, would clerics have the same sort of authority and political relevance today? the clerics that are sort of formally outside politics, let's say? The obvious answer would be no. But I think it's a matter of responding to a need. 2003 came around for Iraq's population, came around sort of very quickly. Within the space of sort of 18 months, we went from imagining Saddam and his family could remain in power for the next 100 years to poof, everything's changed completely. And that sort of very quick timeline meant that neither the population was really prepared for change, because they, for over a generation, they'd been accustomed to the Ba'ath regime, nor were these opposition parties, mainly the Shia Islamists for the purpose of our conversation, nor were they really ready to come in and govern. They were good at being opposition in a sense, an exiled opposition. They could, claim their rich history of standing up to the regime, the sacrifices they'd made had earned them a seat at the table. And they had an identifying ideology, and maybe an electoral ideology, but they did not have a governing ideology. And so I think that was the inadequacies. When the US removed Saddam from power, these parties were not really prepared to govern the country. Now, they may argue that, they weren't given a free hand, the Americans still held all the power, and, violence took hold so quickly. But the fact was, they were not able to manage the country when they did get power. So that meant the community, the population at large, needed somebody else to sort of guide them, because they could not see these powerful parties who they hadn't seen for 20 years, who'd been organizing themselves outside Iraq. Some people had sort of, heard about these parties in the past, the Dawah Party, the Supreme Council, and so on, but they'd never seen anything from them. And they came in as sort of elites. They weren't mixing and mingling with people. And, for a few months, the Americans were still calling all the shots, and they didn't really expect these parties to suddenly, show them what they should do. And so that's when they began to turn to people like Ayatollah Sistani, because they believed he had the credibility, he had the relevance, he had the religious authority and legitimacy, and he wasn't seeking to enter politics formally. He was only going to advise and guide. And so I think that model works. We did not have clerics sort of formally entering politics in that sense from the religious seminary, from the Hausa. Yes, we had clerics who were already politicians, and we have this today, still today. We have clerics like Muqtada Sadr and Ammar Hakim, who are politicians, who run political parties. But I think that question, or that fork in the road, came very early on. And ever since then, I think the population realizes that the Hausa, the religious seminary, the religious institutions are going to be a little bit hands-off and are only there to sort of guide and advise, whereas these other political clerics are just part of the game. They are there to run their own parties and their interests.
And how did it come to pass? I mean, 18 years ago or 20 years ago, it was an open question whether there would be a constituency in Iraq that wanted a rule of the jurisprudence of Velayat al-Faqih, like in Iran. I mean, that was on the table. How did it come to pass that is just not a factor in today's Iraq?
Actually, I mean, that was answered on very quickly. I mean, the parties like, for example, the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq very quickly changed their name to the Islamic Supreme Council in Iraq. They were no longer seeking an Islamic revolution, and they were talking about the need to have a constitution and elections and democracy. And, in June 2003, we have on record Ayatollah Sistani saying that Iraqis should vote for their political system, and it should be one person, one vote, and they should write their own constitution. So right from the beginning, you see the principles of a democracy being mentioned, and at no point do we hear sort of wide demand for a Wilayat al-Faqih system.
So that was maybe a top-down resolution because the clerics weren't interested in it, or simultaneously a bottom-up because the public wasn't interested in it. After decades of Saddam, no one wanted him to be replaced by a single clerical dictator.
Yeah, I mean, they met in the middle, I would say. I think, democracy was something that Iraqis were dreaming about. They'd never thought it would happen. And then when finally they got the chance, I don't think autocracy was something they were very interested in, no matter what type it was, whether it was going to be a monarchy. For example, we had a push to bring back the Iraqi monarchy, but the people that were running that platform never made any headway in politics. So I think most Iraqis wanted to have sort of more of the freedoms that they hoped would be associated with democracy, rather than sort of the autocratic systems that several generations had grew up having. We did not have democracy in Iraq ever, in a sense. And so I think it was a top-down and bottom-up. I think it was something that people wanted, but also the religious institutions realized was the most sensible thing for that period of time.
So, Taif, we're now in a political climate where parties, militias, and patronage networks and personalistic leaders have dominated for quite some time. You talked a little bit about some of the thinking that drove the Shireen protests, which are now almost 4 years, 3.5 years ago. But today, I guess 4 years ago. Wow. Today we're seeing the beginning of the campaign for provincial elections, and I'm curious what has become of that energy, that criticism, in contests for power at the local, provincial level.
Taif speaking again. So I think what I wrote about in the paper was how when these new parties that came out of the protests sort of emerged, they also quickly fragmented. And I outline a number of reasons that they fragmented. So I talk about, or I have talked about somewhere, how a lot of these parties are kind of cults of personality in the same way that the establishment parties are. So they don't have organizational depth. So they're just led by charismatic leaders. And then there have been other issues linked to corruption, linked with how to sort of work within a political system that's largely sectarian when your sort of supporters don't want you to work with sectarian parties. And there's obviously also been violence and there's been coercion. And this has led to that really quick fragmentation. I think that what we're seeing in the run-up to the provincial elections is that same fragmentation. There's no cohesive movement. So at the moment, there are sort of two camps, as there were during the 2021 elections. You have a group of civic parties and independents who aren't participating, saying that we don't have the kind of money that the established parties do, and we don't have the, I mean, they have weapons, and we don't. And then there's another group that's running, but that second group is basically running on a quite an apolitical agenda. So on the basis of a program that includes things like education, disability rights, and the environment. So issues that may not be considered as sort of sensitive as calling for accountability for the protesters that were killed, for example. So I think that that initial energy and the initial possibility has dissipated in the context of a sort of increased repression against these groups.
So the systematic critique has dissipated into a sort of technocratic focus on less polarizing issues. Does has the climate? I mean, is it even possible, given the amount of danger that people face if they cross red lines and criticize the powerful factions? Are those red lines making it so that the political space we saw in 2019 just doesn't exist?
I think it doesn't exist. Yeah, I mean, I think that we've seen a real increase in repression that started with Mustafa al-Kadhimi's government and has now sort of emerged in new forms through the campaign, for example, to preserve public morals. And I think what we saw during the anniversary protest, for example, was a huge pushback against these largely commemorative protests. And last time I was in Baghdad, I also met with a few people, and they were sort of describing the protesters as like devils and bringing back this this rhetoric of them being Baathists that we've seen time and time again from 2011 to 2015, and now sort of in the aftermath of the 2019 protests as well. So I think, yes, there's a huge shrinking of space for kind of alternative ideas.
Renad, how has the how have the boundaries of permissible violence or acceptable violence shifted, if at all, during the premiership of Mohammed Shia Sudani? And if you can speak to how has the operating room, the room for maneuver for dissidents or critics changed in the last year?
Hello, this is Renad speaking, and I'm wearing a white shirt and in front of a bookcase. So the sort of, if you look at the types of violence that seem to be permissible types of violence, some would even say that, for example, a few years ago, the strike on the then Prime Minister's house, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, was part of that permissible violence, right? And many other types of violence against other political parties at the time after elections were all seen as permissible. There wasn't really accountability to that. And you juxtapose those types of violence, whether it's the banks linked to the parties, party offices. Erbil, for example, was attacked quite frequently during the post-election period. If you juxtapose that with what happened at the end of August when the Sadrists went in to the green zone, and at that point, I believe over 30 people were killed, that changed, right? So that type of violence was not part of the permissible violence. And as a consequence, Muqtada Sadr had to come out the next day and apologize for what had happened. And so that kind of shows you the lines of what, this is violence that's not intended to kill many people, especially in broad daylight, but it's certainly meant to remind the elites and competitors that they have power. Under the government of Mohammed Shia Sudani, obviously we haven't seen thus far that the extent of the violence that you would see when groups are negotiating power, because there's some kind of settlement that's currently ongoing. So the violence is certainly less. But I think more importantly, and what Taif is talking about is also important. The October 2019, the Tishreen protests faced quite a harsh response of direct violence that killed hundreds, through snipers and other gruesome ways of protesters demanding their legitimate rights. That is not something that the elites want to do. They don't want to kill in broad daylight because that's not part of the system. If there could be a stronger, mechanisms of repression, bringing in the legal aspects, weaponizing the penal code and laws, as well as the police, that's the kind of violence that moving forward, I think, would be part of this inclusive type of violence. So it's targeted. It's aimed at stopping any potential mobilization of protests, but is certainly making sure that it doesn't happen in broad daylight.
So your sense is that whether they succeed or not, they're trying to create a more of a web of legal repression rather than having to use blatant coercion. And I guess we recently had last month we had a discussion, a live discussion about climate, and one of the panelists was talking about the real systematic, violent targeting of climate activists by the government or by government allied forces. Now, these people aren't being murdered per se; they're being coerced and pressured and silenced or driven into exile. And I'm wondering, is that part of the kind of move does that fit in with what you're saying? Is that the sort of bureaucratic violence as opposed to sort of murder as a way of policing criticism or eliminating independent institutions that can question or hold accountable the government?
Yes, this is Renad speaking. Yes, I think that's exactly it. As I said, October 2019, those protests caught the establishment off guard, and there was a knee-jerk, quick reaction to try and stop the protests, and they had they used violence in a way that killed hundreds. what ideally they're looking for is actually to stop the potential of any type of mobilization like that. And if we're talking about inclusive forms of violence, structural forms of violence in the system, that's where they're looking to ensure and maintain their power. So rather than, again, killing in broad daylight, which is not permissible, across the society, it's about jailing and eliminating candidates from elections and continuing corruption that kills people sort of indirectly in so many different ways. So those are the types of violence that the system will rely on to maintain that elite bargain that continues to govern.
And Maria, as we think about where the system leads, so we've mapped a series of factors above and beyond, or in addition to Shia Islamism and self-defined sect that explain political dynamics. If we are largely at the mercy of political parties that are personalistic fiefs rather than organizations or ideological groupings, what does that lead to long term? Where does the system head?
Well, I think that it's important to go back to, so it's Maria and I'm wearing a white shirt and I have brown hair and I'm sitting in an office. So I think, Thanasi, it's very important to go back to the question of the violence that has been raised by Renad and the roots of this. I think that the roots are really into this erosion of the political landscape. In my chapter, I actually didn't not only want to speak about the Dawa party and its trajectory and its decline, but also the decline of all political parties across the three sects, because across the three sects, we see similar trends where basically the sort of institutions of shared and common decision-making within the political parties, whether they were the party leadership, like in the Dawa party, or the politburos, like in the Kurdish parties, they're basically either non-existing or like they're non-functioning. So they're totally frozen. And therefore, we go back to situations like that one of the Dawa party, but that one also of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, where decision-making concentrates in a non-consultative manner only on single individuals and people, personalities who actually had always had the role of moderating tensions, both within the parties, but also across the political scene, also within the Shia, the Shia sect, are no longer having a role. To give you an example, when there was the latest violence between elements of the Sadrist movements and elements of the Hashd Shabi, but also supported by Nur al-Maliki last summer, some of the members of the Dawa party who had their role in the Dawa party personally told me, well, I wanted to have a role in sort of de-escalating violence, but there was none for me, actually. So it's really, the violence is directly connected to the erosion of the political scene and this consolidation of power within single personalities. So I can only expect that this will actually not only lead to more intra-sectarian violence, but also violence within the same sect. And therefore, I think that it's very difficult from here to predict what the system will look like, but there will be, I think, a lot of contraction and clashes between this old way of doing politics, which is again a personality-based system, and different ways and push back against this, which have emerged with the Tishrini movement, or with the Sadrist movement. But again, also as Taif described, also these other are not really alternative, because so they have some of the dysfunctions of the old way. So again, I mean, I think that it will be a dialectic between the two for some time, or unfortunately, and this I think we have to look very carefully what will happen with the upcoming provincial election, a consolidation, an authoritarian consolidation of this one-man show politics, which I think is very concerning for me, because local elections have been always a way in which they're always very relevant, because they are a way in which also these single individuals, they can also anchor power locally. So we could also actually see that the provincial election, if they go in a certain way, especially if there is no really opposition to this established system, and they could really consolidate a semi-authoritarian system, which will be perfectly synced, I will say, with the regional mood at the moment. So it will not surprise me that it goes down that path, especially if the European and Western powers who still play a role, I think, in Iraq, will continue to just close their eyes on how this political system is becoming increasingly authoritarian and confusing semi-authoritarianism with stability. So I think that also it's a great danger that we are going down that path.
Thank you. And Renad, I'm going to ask you very, very quickly, because we're sort of toward the end of time, to address a question about the regional and transnational context. So these Shia Islamist movements in Iraq with their armed groups, they've been very active in the war inside Syria. There's a lot of solidarity signaling with Gaza, with Hamas, with Hezbollah in Lebanon. We sometimes see the physical presence in Yemen and Lebanon and Syria of these Iraqi groups. So how seriously should we understand this as a cohesive, sort of functionally unified group, or how should we understand how these powerful Iraqi groups fit in that transnational regional context?
This is Renad. I think, very clearly, these armed groups in Iraq, these Shia ones that we've been talking about, are not coherent, and they have different ideologies and different strategies and different goals. Some of them are very Iraq focused, and they are part of the Iraqi political process and part of the Iraqi state, and compete in elections and vie for power in Iraq. Other ones, more vanguard networked ones, don't really buy into the borders, let's say, between Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, and they very much believe in the transnational nature of their struggle. And these groups certainly have influence across the Levant. They have strong connections to Lebanon, to Syria, to Palestine, and in sort of thinking about the escalation and sort of the conflict and war in the region, certainly they do have the ability, and they have shown the ability in the past to be able to deploy. But it is very specific vanguard networks, which make a part of the wider picture of violence, sort of these groups in Iraq.
In a word, Taif, do you think that essentialist labels and ethno-sectarian language will continue to be the dominant mode that we hear about in elections and local competitions for power?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the current parties really stand a chance. The new parties that's emerged after 2019, and especially I want to say, they're actually counting on Sadrist votes in the upcoming provincial elections, which I think will fare really badly for them if Sadr comes out and they're in support of them. So yeah, no, I think it will continue.
Sajad, close us off. I know we're sort of in the middle of so many different things. Final word. What's your takeaway on Shia Islamism as an organizing concept, and what we should what we should think about instead? In seconds.
Shia Islamism is your ticket to power, but once you're there, then you have to do whatever to stay in power, which means pragmatism takes over. And I think that's what we try to point out at the book, that it's not enough just to expect that Shia Islamism as an ideology is what governs Iraq. It's not. It's then the bargaining, the violence, the coercion, the deals, the settlements that keep the system alive. But certainly identity politics is still relevant. We don't have a national party. There isn't a party that's represented in every province, in every district. We don't have that. So we're still organized along ethno-sectarian lines. But also, I think several of the pieces make clear that there is a struggle. There is a struggle with trying to break away from the system that we've had since 2003. And we're probably still at the beginning of that struggle. It's nowhere near the end, and we don't know how long. But certainly from the international community, they're desperate for stability. And if that means a form of authoritarianism, then, unfortunately, people prefer that over sort of the instability from trying to upend a political system.
So I'd say takeaways from this project is you cannot understand Iraq without a updated understanding of what Shia Islamism means, and most importantly, what it doesn't. And you can't understand the region today and the transformations underway unless you understand Iraq. So if you want to know more, you can download this book, and all its contents are available on the Century Foundation's website, Shia Power Comes of Age, the Transformation of Islamist Politics in Iraq. Today, we've been talking with Luisa Fantappie, the Middle East Director at the Institute of International Affairs in Rome, Renad Mansour, the Director of the Iraq Initiative at Chatham House in London, Taif Alkhudary, a doctoral candidate at Cambridge in the UK, and Sajad Jiyad, who is the Director of Iraq Bridge in Baghdad and also a fellow here at Century International. Thank you for everyone who joined us today, and thank you to our panelists for your incredible, dogged long-term work, helping us understand important changing phenomena in Iraq and the Middle East. Thanks, everyone, and until next time.